because I know it's an hour later where you're at, so I don't want to keep you too long tonight.
No worries, no worries.
Thank you everyone who's joining our conversation this evening. It's so great to see so many people on our program. So my name is Dulcie Kirsting Lark, if you haven't met me before, and I'm the Executive Director of the Latah County Historical Society. Tonight we will be hearing from Phillip Thompson, who is the Director and Board President of the Idaho Black History Museum. He's presenting his talk, Black Idaho, Ahead of the Curve. So the Latah County Historical Society presents this program this evening, and we want to say thank you to our fiscal sponsor, the Moscow Women's Giving Circle, who has supported programming related to the presentation of a traveling exhibit that is here in Moscow called For All the World to See, Visual Culture and the Struggle for Civil Rights. It's a really wonderful exhibit presented by or produced by the National Endowment for the Humanities, part of their On the Road series. It is currently at the University of Idaho Library on the second floor. And you are welcome to make an appointment to visit. The library is not just open to the public at this time due to COVID safety protocols, but you can send an email to libspec@uidaho or contact the number on the screen to make an appointment. You can also just visit the library between 10 and 2 on Mondays and 2 and 4 on Thursdays. And you can just give the library a call from your cell phone when you're standing outside, and somebody will come and let you in and you can go visit. So those are kind of some designated visiting hours, but you are welcome to make an appointment during regular library hours. So I hope that many of you will take the opportunity to visit this exhibit. We actually secured this traveling exhibit about 2 years ago, and it's unfortunate that we're now having it in the middle of a pandemic, but it's such an important topic, civil rights, especially given that this was a big election year, and all the conversations that have been happening during 2020 about civil rights and voting rights and human rights, and so we really felt like it was an important thing to bring. And lastly, I will say that this is kind of a way for us to continue the conversation beyond the suffrage centennial. So this year we've really been spending a lot of time commemorating the centennial of the 19th Amendment's ratification. But we always are reminding folks that not all women received the right to vote in 1920. In fact, there was quite a large number of women who were left out. Native American women, Black women, most women of color were not included in the original suffrage amendment. And it would take subsequent civil rights actions, including the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s. If you joined us for our last conversation a couple weeks ago with Dr. Ken Fonts, we talked about popular culture in the civil rights movement. On December 15th, we'll have another speaker, Mary Jane Oatman, who is a member of the Nimiipuu tribe, and she will be speaking about Native American women, Indigenous women, and the suffrage movement. So those are our programs related, but I'm very excited to have Phillip Thompson with us this evening. Phillip's family came to Idaho in 1905 and established Idaho's first Black church, which currently houses the Idaho Black History Museum. If you haven't had a chance to visit, the next time you're in Boise at Julia Davis Park, when we're safe to travel again, I hope that you will visit. It's a really lovely space. So Phillip himself has a really interesting background. He is both a museum director and a man of many talents. He has worked for 20 plus years in information technology. He is a member of the Boise Black Professionals. He works with the Boise Police Chiefs Community Advisory Panel and is a member of the City Club of Boise, and works with Future Public School. And for the last 4 years, he's been working with Parkinson's patients to delay the progression of disease through a regimented approach to sleep, diet, and intense physical exercise to diminish the symptoms of Parkinson's. And previously, he spent 2 years as a researcher at Idaho Neurological Institute, focusing on TBI and movement disorders. So as I said, he's a Renaissance man, but among his many endeavors is the Idaho Black History Museum. So with that, I am going to share screen sharing privileges with Phillip, and he will get us started. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Make sure I do this properly. This is what I'm trying to, is it showing on your end? I'm terrible at this.
Oh, I think you should. I think I just did it, right?
It's a black screen, looks like the Vandals colors.
Do you have your share screen at the bottom now in all of your icons, Phillip?
I just went away. Hold on. It was there before you hit whatever. Hold on. Sorry.
That's okay.
I see you. Share screen. There we go. Can you see that?
Yes, yep, we got it.
All right. Sorry about that.
We're all becoming students of Zoom.
Okay. There we go. All right, thank you everybody for having me. I'm going to give you a little bit of background regarding just kind of like the narrative. If we want to look at where Idaho stands now, we've got to have a little idea of how everything about Idaho is coming to be is kind of contrary to the narrative of what we think of as the Black American experience. And so people often conflate Idaho history and assume it's a similar history to the rest of the United States history, whether it be the slave practicing South or immigration thereafter. And Idaho is rather unique because we don't really fit into either one of those narratives, because Blacks that ended up in Idaho came here by choice and chose not to go further west to California, or were like free from bondage, or left a slave practicing area as a slave, but then were free when they came to Idaho. So that accounts for the minuscule population of Blacks that we have in Idaho, and that lends directly to the differing narrative regarding the progress and the lack of systemic obstacles to Blacks in Idaho. So slavery was never practiced in Idaho, as most know, and Blacks came to the area in the 1860s as miners, trappers, cowboys, farmers, etc., because they were promised a better, or not promised, they were looking for an opportunity to eke out a living for themselves. I mean, there was a very select few that stopped, because for the most part, if you were coming out of the South and you were going to go west, you went all the way west to California, where you knew there were other Black populations to exist amongst your own. There were so few in Idaho that we were never deemed as a threat. And in the 1860s, they came as miners, they came as explorers. But then in 1865, there was actually Black and Chinese exclusionary laws passed in Idaho. Whereas the Chinese were forcibly removed, Blacks were not, because our population was so small. And so we remained. And then even 6 years later, we were able to attend school publicly. 1865, we were forbid from attending school in Idaho public schools. But then by 1871, they were allowed to attend. And that's well ahead of the national curve. Idaho is also one of 7 states that didn't have lynchings. During Reconstitution, over 6,500 Blacks were lynched. This figure is 2,000 greater than the last figure, because the Equal Justice Initiative just this year found out that they had not accounted for the lynchings that took place directly during Reconstruction. In contrast to that, Idaho is one of 7 states that had lynchings, but never a lynching of a Black person. And that's often contrary to the narrative. We think of Idaho as being some bastion for white supremacy. And again, we were always so small of a population, we were never deemed to be a threat. Lastly, I spoke momentarily about the integration of schools. Brown versus the Board of Education was in 1954, where you finally nationally integrated schools where Blacks could somewhat achieve an education on par with their white counterparts. That happened in 1872 in Idaho Territory, before we even became a state. And it wasn't because we were some racial utopia that knew what was the proper thing to do. It was simply because the Black population and non-white population was so small, there was no longer a concerted effort to exclude us from the schools. So the last thing that really came about after being freed from slavery were race riots and actual movements moved to make sure and ensure that Blacks were unable to thrive. Nationally, there were 33 race riots targeting Black Americans specifically during Reconstruction. And probably the most famously known in 1921 was the Tulsa race massacre. In direct juxtaposition of that, the St. Paul Baptist Church was actually erected in Boise, Idaho in 1921. So that just kind of demonstrates the difference in the environments of what was happening to Black Americans in the vast majority of America, whereas Idaho kind of served as, for lack of a better word, a refuge, that we weren't suffering from the same widespread systems of terror that were being suffered elsewhere. My own personal family's perspective, Idaho had an absence of tools of systemic oppression. If above anything else, there were far fewer. Again, I'm not saying it was some racial utopia, because obviously the Chinese were forcibly removed, Native Americans were forcibly removed, but Blacks, we were always so small. To this day, we're not even 1% of the state's population, and this is the biggest we've ever been. I think we're like at 0.6 now. And so the threat of this insurrection of Black people just never existed here. And because of that, we were kind of a inconvenience, but not deemed to be a threat. Yes, you had Klan activity here. Yes, you had anti-Black sentiment, but even the Klan activity in Idaho was much more pointed towards anti-non-Western Europeans than fixated on the exclusion of Blacks. This paper you see is an actual mortgage from my great-great-grandfather, who came here when he acquired the land that we still have in Boise. This is a mortgage for his home because he had paid it off in 1917. So even the simple act of being a Black man owning land, I came across this mortgage like I think last year, that he was able to own and have a bank note securing the land that he could hand down to his family to create generational wealth here in Boise, Idaho. I'm not saying it was perfect, but that was something that didn't exist elsewhere. And then even that picture of the church, that's the church that he erected in 1921. Again, land ownership is what gives you access. And so that lowering the bar of inclusion, having less obstruction to being able to take advantage of what Idaho had to offer, is entirely different than the vast majority of America. Idaho is not immune to the social ills that afflicted the rest of society. Even though my family came here, we found a great opportunity. This was 19 years later, where a Black World War I veteran had a shootout with the police and then killed a police officer or two. At the time, there was actual a FBI meeting being held, a regional meeting being held in Boise, Idaho. Some of you may be aware of Pearl Royal Hendrickson. That was like the first land rights standoff between the feds and a what was called a squatter, but he'd actually been given the land by a white man who had passed. And it ended up being a shootout between he and the feds. He obviously got killed, but this is a part of Idaho history that is not reflective of a disdain for Black people, but we were also not immune to these racial overtones. So Idaho's less talked about history that people tend to totally forget or not get into, is the fact that Idaho has been, for lack of a better word, progressive, or at least ahead of the curve as to what was going on in the nation in comparison to what we were doing locally. For one, Idaho passed a civil rights year 3 years before the federal government. My grandmother worked with the committee to get that passed. The integration of college football was in 1944. My grandfather was the first Black athlete at Boise State. He played football and basketball when it was a community college. Most people are aware now that Idaho and Boise and Pocatello in particular, and Idaho and Twin Falls, are one of the most successful refugee resettlement locations in the world. I met with reps from the European Union shortly after the Syrian war broke out, who sent representatives to 5 states in America, one of which was Idaho, to try to get best practices and worst practices. And they were in awe of how Idaho was able to do so. And so this is one thing that we need to take note of when people are defining and talking about this history of Idaho. It's not as simple as, oh, it's been this bastion of white supremacy conflated with the Confederacy. Yes, we had those who left the Civil War who came to Idaho to establish roots here, but that was simply because Idaho was a territory, it wasn't a state, so it wasn't governed by federal law. People came here hoping to ink out their own way of living. And even with these much more progressive issues, my mother had a cross burning at her house when she was a kid here in the North End, which is probably like the most liberal neighborhood in Boise. The church that my great great grandfather established in the 20s, the church parsonage was burnt down in the 60s. And to this day, running the museum, I still get fan mail probably every couple months. And just last year, a man was arrested and sent to federal prison for making a direct threat. So the threat is still there and it's still alive. Yet what Blacks have encountered in Idaho has historically been far lesser than what we were subject to as far as terror nationally. My mother's mother, Mama Dot, is like the resident hellraiser of our family. She was a social activist, taught us Black revolutionary thought. She was born in Van Buren, Arkansas, youngest of 8. Her family migrated to Idaho like in the 30s when she was, I think, like 5 or 8, 5 or 6, to Minidoka, Idaho, because this was the place promised of a greater opportunity. Why would any Black family move halfway across the country to the unknown in 1935 is reflective of this. In 1919, she was the youngest of 8 kids, so her older siblings saw this. And one of the largest mass lynchings in American history took place in Arkansas. It's called the Elaine Massacre. In the Delta farmland, there was estimates range between 50 to 250 people were lynched. So again, Idaho was somewhat of a refuge in comparison to the terror that Blacks faced elsewhere. I didn't want to inundate or bore you with an overabundance of data. I wanted to have like a two-way conversation and actual talk, but just framing it as such with what I've just given you, that people need to stop and think about, when they think about Idaho and Idaho history, you can't conflate it with the history of the vast majority of America, because everything about how Idaho has come about is kind of antithetical to the traditional segregation of society. Yes, we had in Boise, where we had a large Black population, and in Pocatello as well, you had redlining, you had issues with law enforcement, but you didn't have a systemic oppression of the people based solely upon making sure you were unable to achieve. I mean, the fact that you had land ownership in Idaho, because mine and 3 other families I know pioneered coming to Idaho as homesteaders or building churches. The other half of my family were in Canyon County and they were farmers. But the ability to own land and then hand that land down to your family changes the entire paradigm as far as passing on of wealth, having some stake in the game, for lack of a better word, and being able to set up roots. Blacks were excluded from doing so in the vast majority of our country. Or if in fact they did start to thrive, you had incidents like these 33 race riots that we're actually having on display, our next display at the museum, once we get the green light to open. It's actually being put up now, but we can't have any folks in yet because of the COVID. So we're probably just going to present it electronically, because people are now becoming aware of this system that was put in place to ensure Blacks didn't thrive. So they've heard about Tulsa, they've heard about a couple other riots, but they don't understand that throughout the time of Reconstruction, up until 1950, it was an actual system put in place to ensure that anytime a Black neighborhood, Black city, or Black predominant area started to do well, a race riot would magically ensue and wipe all of that out. And then you have, after that fact, you have the federal government ensuring that we were unable to thrive by the bifurcation of a city, using their freeways to put the Blacks on that side, whites on this side. That then lends itself to segregation of schools. Yes, Brown versus the Board of Education banned segregation, so they found another way to do so. Again, I'm not saying Idaho was utopia that treated all people beautifully, we had no problems, but because Blacks were never deemed a threat, the entire narrative is a little different. Not saying we didn't have to fight, not saying we didn't have to struggle, but absent the systems of oppression that were solely there to ensure you never could do so, it was a half step easier here. I mean, I know it's not a very popular narrative, but especially for my own family, who like, I mean, three branches came here, they compared to what they were facing elsewhere, a bad look or a bad eye or even redlining in neighborhoods was nowhere near what they faced in Missouri, Arkansas, and Oklahoma. And so when we talk about Idaho, we've got to keep that in mind. I'm especially up north where you guys are. Was it Hughes graduated from the University of Idaho in 1899, and the school was built in 1890. So people don't think about that, like how profound of an occurrence that is, that your first Black graduates 9 years after the school was established. Yes, we had Southern sympathizers when the Civil Rights Act was in talk of being passed and letters being written to Bora and those kind of things. But again, they still passed the law for the state of Idaho 3 years before the feds. Yes, we have the uniqueness of Northern Idaho once you go like way north, like Sandpoint, the militia folks, and that narrative. But again, those are people who just want to be away from everybody, so more power to them. That doesn't directly correlate to some system that was obsessed with exclusion of and oppression of Black people. The reason why we don't have a large Black population is because we never practiced slavery. And why would a Black person go from an agrarian lifestyle in the South 3,000 miles across the country to set up an agrarian lifestyle in the North in a place where it's unknown and you're not going to have the safety of numbers? So if you're going this far west, you would have gone all the way west and go to California. You wouldn't stop off in Utah, Idaho, Montana. That's why those places don't have large Black populations. If you look at typical migration patterns of any ethnic group, you go where your people are. There's never been a concentrated mass of us here, so we're still not coming. And even now in Idaho, you have 2.5 times the amount of Blacks of African diaspora or first-generation Americans than you do Blacks as far as generationally American descendants of former slaves. So even now, we have a much larger international Black population than descendants of Black Americans. And again, that's just something people don't think about, and that doesn't occur in most cities. And so I was hoping to I get leave time for people to talk, exchange of ideas, let them go. I'm not sensitive. I'm Black. I'm Muslim. I'm from Idaho, so I don't have the luxury of being sensitive. Let's just have an open conversation.
Well, I love that approach. Thank you, Phillip. I tell you what, maybe would you mind stopping your screen share, and then we can have people could see folks if they want to. If anyone has questions, I would ask you to just maybe use the raise your hand function so we know that you'd like to participate, or feel free to put a question in the chat and I can share those questions with Phillip along the way. The first thing that I would like, Phillip, though, is maybe could you give us a plug for your museum so the next time folks are in Boise, they have it on their bucket list of things to do.
Yeah,
Tell
absolutely.
us a little bit about the history of the museum.
So the museum itself is actually housed in what was the first Black church established in the state of Idaho. The church was built by my great-great-grandfather and great-great-great-grandfather. It actually opened in 99, picked it up, moved it off of Broadway, moved to Julia Davis Park in 98, opened our doors in 99. We've been running ever since. I took over a couple of years ago and kind of tried to navigate it much more into a education space, working with the police force, the schools, et cetera, et cetera. So our last exhibit was actually on the nation's history of lynching, because everybody assumes that Idaho had tons of lynchings and we didn't have any. And so we talked about the national narrative, and we had pictures from the Library of Congress of all these lynchings that had taken place across America. And the one we have now that's actually ready to go, just can't have visitors yet, is on those 33 race riots I spoke of. Because we're trying to show that law is a tool of social engineering, and lawlessness is a part of social engineering as well. That the reason why we have this wealth gap we have now is if you go back to these two issues in particular. So we're trying to kind of provide a framing by talking about whatever problem is going on currently in the news, in the media, and academia, et cetera, give a framing for it that's actually relevant, and then relate it to especially younger folks who just are so removed from a generational perspective, they just don't get it. To see that, especially if you grew up here. I mean, I've got a nephew who, if you try to talk to him about like racial oppression, he just doesn't get it because he's grown up in Boise, Idaho. But frame it in such a way that we're not ignoring the fact that the playground here was a little different than elsewhere. And we're changing exhibits like every 2 months now to really keep it relevant and to incentivize people to come back often. I removed any form of admission fee. That helps too. We work a ton with the schools, so that's been great. So yeah, it's been a kick.
Well, as a fellow museum person, I applaud you for changing your exhibit so often. Oh, I'm jealous that you can do it.
and it's, I mean, luckily I'm board president as well. And I always jokingly say I'm the beneficent dictator. So when I'm not a museum guy, I'm much more a medical and IT guy. So when I took over, or when they hired me to do so, whatever you want to call it, I had a different way of doing things. And I said, just let me try it for a couple of months. If it doesn't work, I'll do everything your way. And it caught fire really quickly. And so we don't run it like a typical museum, so to speak. It's much more like a startup business, get people through the door and be very creative. And we oftentimes have 2 displays on hand. We'll have our main display for the adults, and then we have a kids version of it. I have a kids comic that goes out to teach the issues to them, but in a child-centric fashion, which is easy because I got a 9-year-old. So if she likes it and she digs it, it works for them. And taking that approach has really made the umbrella as far as people who come and visit us much broader. And I purposely courted those who are historically at the other end of the political spectrum. I'm a bit of a centrist myself, so I don't really care. And them asking them to be included went a long way as well, because it kind of diminished that notion of us versus them, and framing things from this perspective of, yeah, Idaho is a little more conservative, but if you look at it demographically and any milestone you would use to measure the accomplishments of a given people, that's not analogous or conflated with the notion of oppression of Black people. Also, the two things aren't mutually exclusive. That conservatism means oppression of Black people, and Idaho history shows it as such. And so it's been really a fun kind of wing it as I go, and run it more like a company, a business, and change up often so people stay interested.
That's so great. Well, I know that Steve and Diane Daly Larson have a question. If you guys want to unmute, go for it.
Well, thanks, Dulcie, and Philip, thanks very much for your presentation. Just a question about other, excuse me, larger immigrant populations, large immigrant populations in Idaho. Do we know that the treatment of those populations was similar to African-American Black populations in other states?
So I'm less aware of other states as much, as I really try to keep it Idaho-centric, but I do know in Idaho, like the first practicing Jew elected in governor in America was in Idaho. The oldest synagogue west of Mississippi is also in Idaho. Mormons found refuge coming to Idaho. So Idaho has kind of been this weird bastion of other peoples for quite some time. The Basques came here in droves, and were originally not treated great, but also kind of assimilated to society as well. So as far as Idaho goes, it seems to be that the numbers of which is what dictated how you were treated, and often if you were white or not white. I mean, because Native Americans were pushed out, very forcefully. Chinese, when the Exclusionary Act was passed, they forcibly removed them, but they were once upon a time like a third of Idaho's population. We've always been so small that it's such a unique perspective. I'm Muslim. I converted as a kid. We have 45 ethnic groups in my mosque because of the refugee resettlement. And those who have left and come back are shocked to see how we live, especially if we were their first destination when they got transferred to America. They assumed this was America in a nutshell. And then so they moved to either San Diego or to Cleveland or elsewhere and realized that they really had something unique in Idaho. and they've come back. So I'm not saying, again, that we're perfect, but for most of those that I deal with in my circle, have always been shocked at how inviting it has been, but that also is coming from what they're coming from originally. And in comparison to the rest of the U.S., Boise and Twin Falls and Pocatello are all quite crime-free, pleasant, and peaceful. So, I mean, that whole framing is a little different. And again, we've never been at a number, any of those groups, to really be seen as a threat.
So there's another kind of a comment and a question here, Philip. So Nancy Nelson says, thanks for sharing this history. I've been to the museum and will always remember the portrait of Martin Luther King Jr. I would like to know more about the kinds of ways that Black people made a living after settling in Idaho.
So one, like the Minidoka, the reason why my family went to Minidoka first and many other Blacks, because of railroads. So they all went there because that's where the railroad went through. When that dried up, and I think it was 1942 or 45, Mountain Home Air Force Base opened up. So that brought a whole nother batch of Blacks in. That's where my mother actually met my father. They got married, and I was born out of that union. So a lot of Blacks came from military. The typical things, railroad, etc. But Boise has a disproportionately high Black professional working class, as far as like middle class and upper middle class, because Micron, the tech sector, HP, that is what brings all the Black people here currently. If you're meaning Black as far as generational Americans, as opposed to refugees or immigrants. And then even like the non-white community that comes here, like from Micron, HP, et cetera. Again, they're being brought in for work for high-tech companies, Micron, et cetera. So those sectors have an entirely different narrative as well. So traditionally, it was like the farmers, part of my family was homesteaders, the railroads, typical menial labor. But because you weren't excluded from attending school, and you weren't excluded from, like my grandfather played for the community college up north, Ginny Hughes graduated from U of I, you were afforded the opportunity, provided you could afford it and went after it, that you weren't kept in that lane, for lack of a better word. So, I mean, again, the numbers are so small to say they were really excluded to one sector. It just doesn't, that narrative doesn't fit because there's always so few of us here. Sure. And to this day, there's still less than 10,000 in Boise.
This is a kind of a tandem question for you, Philip, from Linda. She just said, I'm very interested in knowing if any of your family is still farming.
They are not, but I have introduced my daughter into equestrian training. She's like in month 3 of it. We went horse riding yesterday because her father wants a lazy man's farm. Simply because I don't have the stick-to-itiveness to do like a full-fledged farm, but I'm cool with a few acres, a horse, and a cow or two. And so we went out to Canyon County, which is where our family, the other half of our family, went originally. I told her, this is like what your people did when they first got here, so you got to learn how to ride a horse. And she loves it more than anything, but nobody else is on the range anymore. But I'm hoping to return, because to me that would be just a beautiful thing.
All right. I've got a question here from Gary Haynes. Was listening to an oral history and learned that the KKK was in remote Elk River, Idaho, maybe in the 20s or 30s, when it was a booming logging town. They marched on Main Street and burned a cross. How prevalent and active has the KKK been in other Idaho communities?
So I know the KKK was in Silver City. That's where we got our robe from, was directly there. But again, because the Black population was so small, they were like anti-non-WASP clan. Like they were anti-Greek, anti-Italian.
Anti-Catholic, a lot of them.
Yeah, exactly. So it was the whole because there weren't Black people here. There weren't many Hispanics here back then. And so that's why you didn't have any lynchings. I mean, like I said, my mother had a cross burned on her yard, but there was no physical act of violence perpetrated against the people. The Klan was here, but again, I think it was a lack of being deemed a threat. And that's why you didn't have any acts of violence other than like, we've been vandalized. You get a hate letter or two, a threatening letter or two. But in comparison to places where the Klan actively went out and pursued acts of terror, it just wasn't as widespread here. The Klan was in Pocatello when they dealt with their issue by like passing an ordinance that it was illegal to wear masks in public or something like that. Like they really worked around it in such a way that the Klan, yeah, it was a problem, but not like the Klan as you think of like in Colorado or in the South.
Or even Oregon.
Oregon, yeah, especially. It just wasn't. I always tell people like they say, well, isn't Idaho like this bastion of white supremacy? The first thing I always say is, no, you're thinking of Oregon, and it's entirely different narrative here compared to there, as far as acts of violence perpetrated by.
Just for folks who might not be super familiar with it, could you just say a few words, Philip, about kind of the history of race relations in Oregon? Because that's really interesting juxtaposition, especially when what we associate with Oregon is Portland and this sort of, hub of liberalism.
So Oregon has like the greatest PR firm ever because Oregon was the only state in the Union founded exclusively for whites only. Oregon was the only state admitted to the Union that still had segregationist laws on the book. Oregon had a state that had the largest concentration of Klansmen outside of one capital in the South. Oregon had any law that you could think of as far as miscegenation, blacks in the city after dark, like up until like the 30s or 40s, still on the books. It was founded as a white utopia, and that's why all the blacks lived in Washington, because blacks couldn't even live in Oregon. To this day, you've got, they brought in a police chief 2 chiefs ago, a black woman from Oakland, because they have such a problem with white nationalists and the police force being one and the same or working in cahoots. You see like every year that when you have like the far right folks do their marches, they do them in Portland. Portland, everything about Oregon's history is it was founded especially for white Protestants into discussion, but they've somehow managed to conceal that entire history. And people really think of Oregon as some bastion of liberal thought. And it is liberal thought if you're white, Protestant, and of this very narrow cross-section of society. But everything about Oregon is, for lack of a better word, I don't mean to be speak too much about it, like it's terrifying. And to this day, they're still having problems along with race relations. Oregon has every year a few acts of racial attacks, hatred. Some police officer gets seen being in cahoots with the white supremacists. Our police chief, Chief Lee, came from Portland. And we've talked about it at great length about like it's a whole nother issue over there, but they've managed to keep a lid on it. That unless you go there or you're from there, the vast majority of America has no idea. And when you say Portland, they think it's some like liberal utopia, and it's everything but, if you're black.
This is kind of a related question, another question from Gary Haynes. Is it true that Boise was a sundown town, and were there other Idaho communities that you know of that had that designation?
We know Emmett was. Boise, we have heard talks that it was. We don't know what year it quit being, though. We know for a fact Emmett was, because my mother took a job at Boise Cascade sawmill when they were still out there. Excuse me, she was going through some books one night, and they still had a law in the books that blacks couldn't be in the city after dark. And so there were a few sundown towns in like the rural Idaho. Boise, I don't know for certain, because just Rick Just did a paper about that just recently. He was researching sundown towns, and I don't know if Boise was or not, but many of the small towns around Boise were.
And if any of you if you do the Facebook thing, Rick Just has a page called Speaking of Idaho, and he does some really great research. So if you enjoy learning about Idaho history, I certainly recommend following him. He does a nice job. Those are all the questions that are in our chat at the moment. If anybody else has more questions, please use the raise your hand function or put them in the chat. I was going to add, Philip, as you were talking about making the point that the numbers were really sort of a protective mechanism for Black folks in Idaho. What I've come to understand about the Black experience through the oral histories that were collected here in Latah County, there were a couple that were done, including one with Eugene Settle, who was among one of the pioneer families. There are two families in Latah County, the Settle family and the Wells family, that were African-American families that lived here. And he has this great quote about the interviewer asks, did you ever experience any racial violence or racial prejudice, harassment, that sort of thing? And he said, oh no, everyone was fine. I was the whitest guy in the area because everyone else was a Swede. So there's this like racial hierarchy that exists. Exactly. And it really, what I have come to understand is because the number was so small, it was just a couple of families, really, when you other people, it's more effective to other a larger group of people. Othering a couple folks doesn't get you very far.
Exactly. So if you even look at like any hate map and you look at where hate groups actually exist and thrive, it's never in a place like Montana. Like you'll have a couple like white nationalists or isolationists, they want to make the 41st state or whatever. But if you look at any map and you really look at where hate groups reside and have the largest following and perpetrate acts of violence, it's where the two groups are living amongst each other. It's not like in the middle of nowhere, Idaho or Montana or Wyoming, because it's an entirely different demographic. You know what I'm saying? Just people don't feel threatened. And so you can't use the same galvanizing rhetoric to get people to hate a given group of people if you've only seen like 3 of them and there's not any anything you can hang on their heads as far as, look, they're doing A, B, C, or D, A, they're taking our jobs, A, they're, just whatever it is, because they're just not deemed a threat. I am curious to see, as Boise grows, as Idaho grows, you get much more non-Idahoan sentiment than you ever do non-whatever ethnic group, religion, or whatever. Because people always ask me when I travel, like, oh, I mean, it must be really rough growing up in Boise or in Idaho. I'm like, no, it's a little piece of heaven, but I'm from there, and my family's been here for 120 years. Now, if I was from California or for Colorado or whatever, or driving around with foreign plates or whatever, that's an entirely different narrative. Because one thing I've noticed is that we're much more an insular people as far as whether or not your family's been here for any amount of time than even your religious practice or your ethnic background. And I'm not trying to sell it, but just we seem to be much more a hospitable, I may not even agree with you, but you do you, I do me, provided it doesn't perpetrate on doesn't cross the line of what I'm doing, doesn't transgress about what I'm doing. Idahoans in my time have always been chill. I mean, yes, you have your isolated incidents of you're dealing with a schmuck, but overall, it's not an issue. I mean, I boxed for 20 years and traveled around like Podunk, Idaho, literally beating up the people who lived there as an adult. I didn't stop boxing until I had a kid. And never once was a racial epithet hurled to the ring. And we had people from the lower rungs of socioeconomic status. We had Native Americans. Our team had a conglomerate of people from all over the world because people from my mosque came and boxed with us too. And never once did it devolve into a racial, throwing back and forth. And these are adults and kids literally beating each other up, but never once did it spiral out of control or even something being spoken improperly. And I think that's more reflective of kind of the Idaho way, as they say, is that a kind of live and let live. You do you, I'll do me. And provided you're doing what you do and don't bother me with what I'm doing, it's not perfect, but we get it done pretty well.
I agree that Idaho certainly markets itself as a live and let live state. We don't always practice it in that fashion, but that's certainly the mantra we have. Yeah. There is a comment in here, a question kind of from Nancy Nelson again. And so you've talked a lot, Phillip, about how you've grown up and kind of the historic experience in Idaho, but asking you to be sort of a contemporary or a prognosticator, maybe a contemporary thinker. Do you worry that Idaho is becoming more attractive to people who want to be in an all-white community.
Oh, totally. We're the redown destination to be. But that's always been part of the underlying current of why people came to Idaho. Even if you go to like before we achieved statehood, to the Confederates coming up here, to in the 90s where it became the expat for all former LAPD around like the Rodney King era time, when Coeur d'Alene, not Coeur d'Alene, just north of Coeur d'Alene, became like this a place where all the former LAPD, et cetera, have kind of taken refuge up there. There's even realtors now who market Northern Idaho based on like, guns and the coded language of basically saying, white conservatism. And again, maybe because I just grew up here, so I don't like look at that fearfully, because it's kind of like a byproduct of what precipitated that school of thought, right? I mean, I'm not saying they're all intellectual. I'm not saying they're all bad, but I am saying that there is a lot of things in that school of thought that if I lived in elsewhere where it's like chaos, it's easy to cloud your thinking and think incorrectly. Like Northern Idaho kind of creeps me out, I'm not going to lie, but I get it, but I'm not fearful of it, because I think at the same time, for every 5 that move up there, there's 500 coming here who are a little more centrist to left. Or even if you do want to be a little more traditional, I don't think traditionalism and pro-gun always means anti-black. Yes, I know there's a contingent up there who want to be there because it is very monochromatic, very Eurocentric, very American, old school of thought, kind of like this whole "Make America Great Again," yada yada ideology, but much more extreme than that. But I'm not fearful of it, because fear just immobilizes you anyway, and they're not actively pursuing acts of crime or aggression going there. If I want to live like amongst Muslims or Baptists or black people or whatever, I'm not vilified for wanting that. And so I'm really apprehensive to assume that because you say you want to live, if you're Jewish, you want to live next to Jewish people, I'm not going to conflate that as, oh, you're anti-Muslim, right? Or if you're white and you're from wherever and you think you want to go move to a place where you have, freedom to carry unconcealed and live next to Christian people, whatever, more power to you. I'm not alarmed by that. But I think we should be mindful of it. But at the same time, I don't take issue with, that's rather naturally human. Like from a neurological standpoint, that's what humans do. I mean, multiculturalism is a uniquely recent occurrence in human history. And so for us to assume that all humans should be okay with it, that's just naive. And they've come into the museum. I mean, I've chit-chatted with a few. I mean, from former card-carrying skinheads to okay, tell me why I should care about A or B or C. And provided I don't confront them on their thought and simply confront them with a sound argument that is contrary to what they think, you'll see this kind of aha experience go off. Like, I'm not assaulting your thought. I'm simply showing you how it's flawed, that something in opposition of what you believe does exist. So maybe that makes your premise untrue. I'm not going to assault you on it, but I'm simply going to provide you with a fact that's contrary to what you think is a standard or is a reality. And then when you see that that's not always true, it opens up just a sliver of them to realize, okay, I'm talking fine with this gentleman, so evidently it's not, all hope is not lost. But granted, I'm from Idaho, so I mean, it's you learn to you know how to live in the jungle.
It sounds like you have a lot of practice with those conversations.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, if you're born in the jungle, you know how to survive in the jungle. I mean, and it's just, you don't need to. I mean, I have to choose what I'm going to devote my energy to. Some fights are pointless, but if you can show a lack of thought without assaulting them or assailing them or insulting them, they're much more receptive.
Certainly. There's a comment in here. I don't know if you can speak to it, Phillip, from M. Minton. do you know anything about Billy Rhodes from North Idaho circa the 1860s? He was one of the most successful miners at the time and was known for his generosity.
I do not. I do know of two other. There's like three peaks or reservoirs in Idaho. They're named after black miners that got like filthy rich or did quite well. But I do not know that one. I know there's like black men over in the Owyhees, and then there was a reservoir that I just forgot the name of who did the same. But I'm not familiar with Rhodes.
Well, we'll all have something to look up now. There's another question here from Lisa. In high school, did you feel isolated or struggle with being distanced because of your difference? Do you feel that the high school experience today for students from minority groups has improved at all?
So I didn't like high school. I thought it was like the biggest waste of time ever. But I was always on my own thing, even from like junior high school wise. I mean, my brother was kind of like the Mr. Congeniality, you know, athlete, popular guy, et cetera, et cetera. I was like the resident Black Panther, Black nationalist, isolationist, studying Islam, and want nothing to do with the society in which I grew. Everything with me was history, philosophy, and reading. I didn't care about what was going on in school just because I thought the entire school system was built to oppress us as a people. I was a bit of a revolutionary as a kid. And so I had no desire to really get in that high school clique thing. All the crew I hung with were older than I because all the black kids I knew were older or a year behind me. But I didn't like the whole high school thing. So I didn't ever feel isolated or insulated because I had like one of my closest friends was a good old boy, Hunter, great guy. Me and his family were close. A couple guys I played tennis with, but I didn't like the high school experience. So I never felt insulated or isolated. I just didn't care. I didn't like it. I could do what I wanted to do. I spoke my mind often, but I never really dug it. So I didn't long to be a part of it. But at the same time, I didn't feel like I couldn't be if I wanted to. I simply just didn't like it and kind of kept myself out of it for the most part. It was just, I thought it was pointless. And I think for kids now, it's entirely different between social media and the ability like to badger somebody constantly, and the fact that, you know, you can't get a minute of privacy. I've been called in for a couple Muslim students that had issues at the school, being called terrorists or women who wear hijab being harassed. I think they face much more than I ever would have, because number one, I'm a guy, so they're not going to come at me the same way they would a woman, because a guy, they, you know, will punch you back, and back then it was okay to fight. Nowadays, if you're a woman being harassed for wearing a hijab or whatever, you're almost like defenseless and you're half scared and, you know, you don't know what to do. So I think the dynamic is much different now. It's far worse for them than I think it ever would have been for me or even other black kids now, because there's so much more of us. And I might be wrong, but acts of overt racism seem to be totally not tolerated, whereas acts of ethnic intolerance or mockery is like, oh, okay, even though it's not great. You know what I'm saying? It's okay to dislike the woman in the hijab, but God forbid if you ever use the ethnic slur talking about a black person. Like derogatorily. You know what I'm saying? It's just, it's a whole different, one's okay, one is not. I could be wrong, but I'm just saying I think it's a different narrative now, that the targeted group is not us as much. And there's a lot more of us now.
Thank you. There's another question in here, Philip, kind of a personal question. So if you said you're an open book, so.
Amazing. Yeah.
Wondering if you see the Confederate flag as an act of aggression. The questioner says that they spent Thanksgiving around Sandpoint, and there was a noticeable increase in the Confederate flags from when they had visited a few years ago.
So I don't, because I'm from Idaho. And so I saw it all the time, but I'm always leery of when I see it. But what's so bad now is I'm leery of seeing an American flag now, because now that's like the new coded act of supposed patriotism, is flying like this obnoxiously large American flag on everything. It's kind of like coded language, because the Confederate flag has been so vilified, or the American flag with the blue line through it. It's like to fly any flag is cool. Yeah, and patriotism is a beautiful thing, but it's like the coded language of what it means now. So the Confederate flag, at least I know where you're coming from more often than not. I think it's comical when I see the Confederate flag and the American flag flying together, which you see a lot around Boise. And I'm saying you realize that that was an alien enemy entity that attacked us as a foreign power. So that just makes absolutely no sense historically. And so what you're trying to say, you don't even understand. You want to fly the Confederate flag, but trying to come halfway with it. So I don't get like threatened or take issue with it, but I'm aware of what they're trying to say when they do so. And I'd much rather my enemies fly the flag so I know where you're standing than those that try to placate you and pretend like it's all love and happiness. It's great to know where they stand because you can see them coming from much further away.
I too have to scratch my head when I see an American flag and a Confederate flag flown together, and I think, oh no, your history class wasn't very good.
Exactly.
So I'll pose this final question to you, Philip, and then we'll thank you again for your time. Do you think that systemic racism against Black, Indigenous, people of color is less pervasive and common in Idaho society than in places where Black populations are a larger portion of the total population?
First of all, I don't think you can conflate Black and you can never define anything by non-white. Like you'll never hear me say people of color. You'll never hear me say, the BIOP or whatever it is now, the amalgamation that is non-white people they try to use now, because you're trying to, when doing so, you're saying that the narratives for those three are all the same. My struggle is nowhere near what the Native Americans who lived here before my people got here, what they've been through, because they were systemically picked up, uprooted, put on a barren land, and expected to die off there. Whereas my people came to a land, took land to farm, hoping to thrive, right? So the narrative is entirely different. And then somebody coming here as a worker visa for Micron, who may be Pakistani or Indian, but as an engineer at Micron, yes, he's non-white, yes, he's a person of color, but his narrative is entirely different than the person who is coming here to work on the bottom end of the socioeconomic scale, who's also non-white. So, just to conflate them makes absolutely no sense. I do think the obstacles we face are entirely different, predicated on that background, number one, and how aware you are of the history of our area. Luckily, Boise and Idaho as a whole has never had like a dearth of jobs. They don't have good paying jobs, but for the most part, up until recently, most people could always be gainfully employed and afford a house or an apartment or whatever. Up until like the last 15, 20 years, the cost of living was very cheap here. So you didn't have this stratification of society that caused a large section of society to not be able to achieve. If you look at like these different measurements as far as where you have this haves and have-nots, you also have this correlation of like racial animus and discord. And so I think it's much more indicative of that. Like I think we oversimplify like these issues related to ethnicity, race, etc., and not looking at like the big economics resource issue. Because one paper I'm actually working on currently, just to irritate people, is this theory that Blacks have done better socioeconomically in more conservative environments, simply because there's a lack of scarcity of goods. And so when you look at it from that perspective, I mean, California had mass lynchings of natives, Chinese, and systemically made sure Blacks could never go to any good schools or anything else. So you can't just say that liberalism is good when everything that is done there has not worked for the best. You know what I'm saying? It's just because they have a lack of goods, more people, the scales are totally shifted, that we need to look at it a little more deeply to see what is the underlying cause of this disconnect socially. And there are all these weird little socioeconomic factors, access to healthcare, generational wealth, homeownership, all these things that come to play that nobody wants to talk to. And we're oversimplifying by, it's white versus non-white, when those narratives of those non-white, and I refuse to be labeled as a non-anything, are entirely different. And so that's even if you really want to fix the issue, okay, let's look specifically. Are we talking about unskilled workers from the Philippines, or are we talking about highly skilled workers from the Philippines? Because they're going to have two entirely different narratives. It can't just be classified as non-white immigrants. It's not that simple. If we really want to fix anything, I'm a nerd, so I like specifics, I like numbers, but we really have to dig into them as opposed to taking this cop-out and lazy way of thinking that everything's bifurcated as white or non-white, because by doing so, you're still practicing white supremacy, and nobody seems to really understand that.
I think we are all learning so much about language now. And it's eye-opening to me. I mean, I went to graduate school not that long ago. I'm not that old, but, and I feel like even since I was in graduate school, the language that we use to discuss issues has really changed. So I really, what you just said, like I refuse to be labeled as non-anything, I think is really something that we all need to be considering. So we're right at 7 o'clock, and I know that's 8 o'clock your time. So I want to thank you again, Philip. I look forward to when you can open your museum, as do many people in the chat. Many people said they can't wait to visit. So there you go. You've already got people on the way.
That's great. Sounds good.
Thank you again so much for your time. Again, I remind everybody to visit the exhibit for all the world to see if you have the opportunity. It really is a great visual representation of the civil rights movement and its interaction with popular culture. And if you have any questions, you can find Phillip through the Idaho Black History Museum. And again, the Latah County Historical Society has been proud to present this program, and we look forward to seeing you on December 15th for a discussion about Indigenous women and suffrage. So everybody have a great evening. Thank you.
Thank you.